able to. So great work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Okay. Well, I think we can start now, and shortly in this next seconds, people will join us again. Someone sorry is connected, but just the cameras. So, well, Marlene, thank you. Thank you for joining us. You know, I first of all, well, nice to meet you because it's the first time I know about you, but you have a seminar, I think so, in university, not the University of Toronto.
That's where I teach at University of Toronto.
Yeah, but there's a seminar. You run a seminar, I think so, right? On early modern philosophy or something.
Early modern research group where we have.
Yeah, exactly. That's the reason. Yeah, I know you. So,
yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us, and well, it's a pleasure to listen now your talk. So, when you are ready, please just yeah.
All right. Great. I think maybe I'll share my screen. I suspect that looking at the talk, which is also in the chat, but that looking at the talk will be more instructive to you than looking at my face, which probably will appear as a little thing. So if you really want to look at my face, you can do it. But I think that may be more instructive. So it's an outline of a talk. It's an outline of the talk. It's very detailed, which hopefully will make it easier to follow. It's part of a paper that I'm writing with Alison Simmons, and it's a paper about Margaret Cavendish and Anne Conway. And part of what the paper argues is that although Cavendish is often labeled a materialist and Conway is often labeled a spiritualist, that really doesn't do justice to how similar they are, because actually the properties, the fundamental properties that they assign to their fundamental entities are not really different. So that's one part of the paper, but I don't have time to do that whole paper here. So I'm just doing the Cavendish part. And thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to meet you all and give this is my first Zoom conference where I give a talk.
It's a new experience.
Yes,
for most of all, don't worry.
No, I know, with all the stumbling that comes with it. So I have now shared the screen with the outline of the talk. So I just gave you the introduction to the talk, and I want to begin with setting up some background. So Cavendish rejects dualism. She is what we label as a vitalist. She thinks that everything in the natural world is material, but it's alive and it has mental states. So it has sense perceptions, reason, and even freedom. But to, to shed light on the argumentation, I want to highlight two crucial motives for dualism in the period. One of them was a need for material, oh my gosh, sorry, that's a huge typo. It's a need for immaterial entities to explain natural phenomena. Okay, you know what? I'm just going to stop sharing for just a sec, and I'm going to share my a document where I can make changes if I see blazing errors like I just did. Okay. Okay. So need for immaterial entities to explain natural phenomena. And secondly, there was theological demand for human exceptionalism, the view that human beings are very different from the rest of nature. And that came from the demand for the immortality of the human soul and only the human soul. So animals, from this perspective, do not have immortal souls, even if they have souls in some sense or other. Now, Margaret Cavendish's response to both of these motives is that immaterial entities are not necessary. Indeed, they're problematic and unhelpful to explain natural phenomena. And secondly, she blends human beings completely into the rest of nature. So she rejects the idea that human beings are radically different from the rest of nature and that they're very special. To really get her argument, you need to look at Henry Moore's dualism as opposed to Descartes. So for Descartes, he thought you could explain everything in the natural world in terms of matter, except for human thought, as we all know. But Henry Moore and many others in the period thought that was vastly too optimistic, which I think is always amusing because from a contemporary perspective, because in the Anglo-American world, people are often skeptical about dualism, and they say that we should think that we can explain even thought in terms of material matter. But in the 17th century, the reaction was exactly the opposite. So for Moore, there are not only human immaterial souls, but there are animal souls that are immaterial. And most importantly for today, an immaterial spirit of nature that explains natural phenomena other than thought. So Moore and others thought that many phenomena within the physical world required appeal to an immaterial entity to explain them. And Moore was a very important target for Cavendish. She explicitly argues against him, in particular in her philosophical letters, which are really, it's a really great work where she explicitly engages with Hobbes, Descartes, Moore, and Van Helmont. I don't know what it's like in Mexico, but in the English-speaking world, there's a ton of attention for Cavendish right now. The literature on Cavendish is just exploding. Mm-hmm. And I've been dragged along, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And I find it really, really interesting. It's been incredible fun for me. But for Moore, all substances are extended, including immaterial substances. All substances are extended and active. Even God is extended, as the discussion, the correspondence with Descartes reveals. But he does think that bodies and immaterial substances are extended in different ways. And he thinks they are different in that bodies are divisible, immaterial substances are indivisible, bodies are impenetrable, immaterial substances are penetrable, and they differ with respect to the type of activity that characterizes them. And I won't read this quote, but it illustrates what he holds. So going on to activity, so the notion of activity is going to be important to this paper. For Moore, bodies can communicate motion, but they cannot initiate it, which is a very traditional point of view. Only spiritual substances are self-moving. And that's what he says in the second quote that I have on the handout. Mm-hmm. Sometimes Moore writes that bodies are passive, which sounds maybe like they couldn't do anything. But when he says that, he really has the lack of self-motion in mind. Moore often casts this contrast in terms of life. So immaterial substances are alive, and he also often writes that they have perception. And that is an interesting way of characterizing it. So the notion of life is often used by these thinkers to ascribe to things capacity for initiating activity, or what they called self-activity. Furthermore, for Moore, mechanistic explanation has severe limits within the physical world. He thinks there's lots of specific natural phenomena other than thought that cannot be explained in terms of matter. And most importantly for us today, for my paper, is he thinks that mechanism can't explain the order that we find in the world. For Moore, and also for his friend Cudworth, a purely mechanistic world is disorderly. There's chaos, and that's an idea that goes back very far to, for instance, Plotinus. The order of the world for more requires appeal to God's laws. God is the ultimate source of order. God issues commands, but these commands need something to execute them. And more thinks that the entity that executes them must be an immaterial entity. And that's why he thinks we need what he calls a spirit of nature or a hierarchic principle. And that notion of the spirit of nature is really important for what I'll be talking about in Cavendish. In The Immortality of the Soul, More describes the spirit of nature as follows. So it's worth looking for a moment at this quote. He writes that it is a substance incorporeal, but without sense and animadversion, pervading the whole matter of the universe and exercising a plastical power therein, according to the sundry predispositions and occasions in the parts it works upon, raising such phenomena in the world by directing the parts of the matter and their motion as cannot be resolved into mere mechanical powers. So More's point is that this spirit of nature is active. It's an internal active principle installed by God in nature as it were like a computer program. And that comes out in the next quote. He writes, "But now I perceive all things which are made in the free course of nature are not only approved of by divine wisdom, but their laws were implanted in the spirit of nature by the help of God." So the spirit of nature has the laws of God imprinted on it, and it executes them. Now you might think that the model is one of obedience to God, or maybe he wouldn't, but at any rate, I'm going to say this, which would require mental states in the spirit of nature. But that's clearly not More's idea. The crucial idea is that the spirit of nature is active. More definitely denies rationality and freedom for the spirit of nature. And he's sometimes hesitant about sense perception, as in the next text, which I won't read to you. But as we saw above, in quote number 3, he also sometimes definitely denies that the spirit of nature has sense perception. In sum, a crucial role for the spirit of nature is to explain the efficacy of the laws of nature. And that is a really important issue in this period with its new focus on natural laws. It contrasts more with Descartes, who had a very different view. For Descartes, the laws of nature are the laws of motion, and the laws of motion result from the fact that A, God has implanted motion in the world, and B, God conserves the motion in the world at all times. And so as a result, the laws of motion actually describe the divine conservation of motion, which Descartes thinks he can derive. He can derive these laws then from God's immutability. Or think about Malebranche, where the laws directly describe God's activity in the world. Okay, so one issue in the spirit is definitely the emergence of the notion of natural laws. They were often conceived of as divine commands, which is not how Descartes conceives of it, but we need not go into that. But then the question was, how are these commands effective in the world? And More, as well as Cudworth, thought that this requires an intermediary. It's not the case that God directly produces effects in the world in accordance with these laws. So that's the background. And now I want to turn to Margaret Cavendish herself. So she argues that the order of nature does not require immaterial entities. First of all, and we'll see the details of this in a moment, they don't help explain anything because she thinks these are highly problematic notions, the notions of immaterial created entities, let alone natural immaterial created entities. We'll get to that later, but she also argues, and this is what I want to focus on now, is that they are superfluous. She thinks matter itself can do the job. She then offers a vitalist conception of matter as alive, as active, and endowed with sense and reason. This is in part motivated by her criticism of mechanical interaction. She does this in her philosophical letters, in particular targeting Hobbes. And it leads her to argue that since mechanical interaction just doesn't work, so she thinks mechanical explanations a no-go. It leads her to argue that matter itself is active in the sense of self-active. We'll see in a moment more about that. She assumes in her criticism of Hobbes that the transmission of motion is a case of the literal transmission of motion, as it were, the hopping of one mode or one quality or action or whatever from one thing to another. And that was uniformly ruled out in the period. So you could call this the accidents don't migrate principle. Cavendish also argues that motion can't be separated from the body and be given to another body in another way. She then argues that it requires that some of the matter of that body would travel with the motion, and that isn't happening. So since motion cannot be literally transmitted from one body to another, the question is, how does it work? How does, humanly speaking, one ball make another ball move? She favors a model of occasional causation. And this is where she invokes self-activity. A body starts to move itself on the occasion of a prompt when triggered by another body in virtue of its own activity. So her model is occasional causation, not occasionalism, as Malebranche accepted it, where the idea is that the only cause is God. No, bodies are causes, but they cause their own motion. That motion is not really caused by an external body. Rather, a body, when it starts to move upon impact, it has a perception of what the other body is doing, and in response to that, it starts to move. That's the picture. And so it's on the occasion of impact that a body starts to move. So matter is self-active. And now turning to the disagreement with Moore, she agrees with Moore that a purely mechanistic world would be chaotic. There would be no order. And it's not super easy to identify what exactly is going on here, whether they always thought that there would just be no order at all, or whether they thought that the order that we find in the universe could not be explained by mechanists. It seems that they think the order of nature, that there would be no order of nature if it had a purely mechanistic world. But they also thought of the order of nature in some sense teleologically. Like Moore, she accepts the idea that order comes from God. But then the question that Moore asks, she also asks, how are divine commands or laws or divine plan executed? We saw from Moore it requires an immaterial entity because matter is passive. That's one important reason. Cavendish argues matter can do the job because matter is active. And moreover, she adopts a model in which matter executes God's plan in virtue of its obedience to God. So in quote number 6, she attacks Moore's view that you need an immaterial entity. And her language is very colorful, so I enjoy reading this out, and I will do that. She writes, but Moore thinks it's absurd to say that the world is composed of mere self-moving matter. You may consider that it's more absurd to believe immaterial substance or spirit in nature, as also a spirit of nature, which is the vicarious power of God upon matter. For why should it not be as probable that God did give matter a self-moving power to herself as to have made another creature to govern herself? It's very hard not to think of Locke here, where she writes that God might give matter a self-moving power. I'm not sure that that's what she has in mind. Locke, of course, thought that God gives motion to matter, but also thinking to matter. Going on, for nature is not a babe or child to need such a spiritual nurse to teach her to go or to move. Neither is she so young a lady as to have need of a governess, for surely she can govern herself. She needs not a guardian for fear she should run away with a younger brother or one that cannot make her a jointure. A jointure is a financial provision. So she very colorfully says here that nature itself can order itself and execute the divine commands. Now, in this passage, you might think that her view is that that nature itself is the source of order and that you might not even need God, but that's not her view, because earlier in her philosophical letters, she cites the Genesis story of God issuing a variety of commands which generate order in what was a rude and undigested heap or chaos without form, void, or darkness. And then she writes, thus all was made by God's command, and who executed this command but the material servant of God, nature, which ordered her self-moving matter into such several figures as God commanded, and God approved of them. So she denies the need for an intermediate, immaterial entity. Instead, nature herself as a whole, as it were, commands her parts to implement the divine plans. So her model includes the idea that matter is self-active. It also includes a model on which matter is obedient to God, and nature as a whole orders its parts, and the ordering language also suggests a picture of obedience. So unlike for her, the divine commands are executed by his servant, in this case matter, in virtue of its activity as well as obedience. And she clearly wants to ascribe to matter mental states. So in quote 8, she writes, self-moving matter, which is the only principle of nature, is infinite, and there are no more principles but this one. It's true, regular compositions and divisions are made by consent of parts and presuppose number and harmony. But number and harmony cannot be the cause of any orderly productions without sense and reason. For how should parts agree in their actions if they did not know each other, or if they had no sense or reason? So she thinks that the execution of the divine plan essentially involves the parts of matter having sense and reason. So this is a very striking model. Karen Detlefsen has argued in several papers that Cavendish relies on an intensely social model of the universe. So whereas a mechanist might want to reduce human behavior to mechanism, Cavendish does exactly the opposite. She takes human behavior, social behavior, which involves mental states. She takes that as the starting point and applies it to nature as a whole. So given this conception of matter as having all these mental states, sense and reason, it's not surprising that Cavendish argues against human exceptionalism. And she does so with some energy, I would say. First of all, she rejects the idea that there are human immaterial souls in nature. She argues that the notion of immaterial entities or immaterial created entities at least is seriously problematic. She writes, I'm just listing them, I have no time to go through the details. We ourselves are material beings and so cannot understand immaterial beings. And spirits can have no description because they have no dimension. She describes them as non-beings, nothing, or non-matter. And like so many people in the period, she argues against mind-body interaction. And given the impossibility of the action of immaterial substances on matter, of course, that makes them useless in explaining any natural phenomena in the physical world. Sometimes she does write that human beings have immaterial supernatural souls. She does so in the philosophical letters. And then she seemed to attribute them some religious function. But at the same time, she makes comments that suggest that even for religious functions, you don't need to believe in an immaterial soul, in the sense that she writes that all of nature worships God, all of nature does, and that there's an innate notion of God in all the parts of nature, although not a perfect knowledge. So in terms of religious practice, this would seem to make the immaterial soul superfluous for religious purposes. Sometimes, as I suggested, she does allow that we have immaterial supernatural souls. And in the philosophical letters, she writes that this is the only difference between humans and other creatures. Some interpreters have argued that she only allows them so as not to get in trouble with the church. In a very interesting paper, Emma Wilkins argues that she abandons them gradually, in particular in the ground of natural philosophy. She writes, I find this a quite remarkable passage, so I will read it to you. I cannot conceive how an immaterial can be in nature. For first, an active immaterial cannot, in my opinion, be naturally created, nor can I conceive how an immaterial can produce particular immaterial soul spirits or the like. Wherefore, an immaterial, in my opinion, must be some uncreated being, which can be no other than God alone. If there were any other immaterial beings besides the omnipotent God, those would be so near the divine essence of God as to be petty gods, and numerous petty gods would almost make the power of an infinite God. But God is omnipotent and only God. So she suggests that if there were immaterial souls, this would actually violate monotheism. She also argues, and this is the last substantial point in the paper, against human exceptionalism within the material natural world. So she argues rationality does not presuppose language. This is on the assumption that only humans have language. There's no ground for denying rationality to other creatures. Maybe they have a different kind of rationality, but not an inferior one. And just because we can't communicate with other creatures doesn't mean that they are not rational. And in another colorful text, according to my reason, I can't perceive, but that all creatures may do as much. But by reason, they do it not after the same manner or way as man. Man denies they can do it at all. What's very hard, for what man knows, whether fish do not know more of the nature of water, and ebbing and flowing, and the saltness of the sea, or whether birds do not know more of the nature and degrees of air, or the cause of tempests. For though they have not the speech of man, yet thence doth not follow that they have no intelligence at all. So she pretty vigorously argues against the idea that human beings are very, very special. Now, her argument against the special nature of humans winds up addressing the question of immaterial souls, but she never criticizes the idea that God is an immaterial being. As we saw above, God is the only immaterial being. We're not capable of really knowing God. That's beyond us as a material being. We do have a partial notion of God, And she lists various traditional features that distinguish God from creatures. And that leads me to the end of the paper. So I drew attention to Cavendish's argument that the order of nature does not require immaterial entities. While the order does derive ultimately from God, she thinks that immaterial entities are not necessary and matter itself can execute the demands. And then it's not surprising that she thinks that humans are not dramatically different from the rest of nature. Everything is alive, senses and reasons. And on various grounds, she strongly opposes human exceptionalism. Thank you.
Hi. Hey, thank you, Marlon. Well, this is splendid, your presentation, honestly. And first, well, I don't know if someone has questions or doubts or comments or everything. Now is your time, guys. Enrique, please go ahead.
You're muted.
You'd mute, Enrique. Again. Yeah.
That was not a technical issue. That was my stupidity. My apologies. Marlene, so good to see you. Thank you very much. What a wonderful paper. Just I'm an ignoramus, so bear with me. Tell me a bit more about her views. I mean, you touch upon it, about her views of animals. So this is more of a Spinocistic view, to call it that, in the sense that there are minds pretty much everywhere in the animal world, but how fancy can they be? Rational.
Yeah.
And can you say more about her views on animals, an animal mind? Thank you.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and she doesn't talk a lot specifically about animals, but she thinks nature in general senses and has reason, right? Throughout. Every particle of matter is a mixture, or blending, she says, of 3 degrees of matter: inanimate matter, sensitive matter, and rational matter. So rationality is literally everywhere. And her whole model of natural explanation, or explanation of natural phenomena, relies on that view of matter as sensitive and rational everywhere. About animals, you saw the quote I gave you, that for all we know, fish know more about water than we do, and the birds more about storms. And it's so interesting because some years ago, I read a book called Clever as a Fox, which is a contemporary book about humans talking about animal rationality. And it discusses the difficulties of assessing animal intelligence because the kind of issues that animals care about are so different. And so when we try to assess animal intelligence, we always throw them, as it were, human questions, but their focus is elsewhere. And it's very interesting to see Cavendish basically voicing a similar opinion about animals, that their lives are very different, so maybe they just know a lot more about other things. So occasionally, and I'm not in a good position to pronounce on this, but strikingly, Conway also is an egalitarian in it, but in a different sense. So she does think that humans are at the top of the scale, but she thinks that all creatures will eventually reach the top of the scale over the course of time. So there's a different kind of, it's a trans-temporal egalitarianism. And occasionally people say that women thinkers have been more sympathetic historically speaking, to the rights of animals than male thinkers. I have no idea whether that's true, but I also ran into that claim. Yes, I see someone smiling. I also saw there's this fantastic biography of Darwin by Janet Brown, and she mentions one of Darwin's contemporaries, and a woman that he knew was a very fierce animal rights activist. And Janet Brown, who's a historian of science, throws out a comment like that. So I'm just throwing that out there. I'm not claiming this as a truth, but it's intriguing. Yes.
Muchas gracias.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, Alberto.
Thank you, Merlin. I'm just wondering, and surely you can help me, if what is the place in Cavendish? Where is the place, if any? Where is the place of this tradition of the Prisca Theologia? I mean, of Hermeticism.
Oh, Hermeticism.
Yeah, if there is a place, a role that Hermeticism plays in the Cavendish conception of matter and nature, or not. I know.
Not that I know. So I'm not super confident about the extension of the term Hermeticism. Mm-hmm. Conway has often been connected with Van Helmont and an influence of Van Helmont, mm-hmm. And influence of the Kabbalah and so on and so forth. Cavendish is a different person because she didn't have the kind of education that Conway had. So she was self-educated, and if you take her word for it, and she wrote her earlier works before she read a whole lot of philosophy, and then she read some more, like for the philosophical letters, she read more philosophy and then started to respond to her contemporaries. I haven't seen in my readings a reference to Hermeticism in relationship to Cavendish. Mm. Eileen O'Neill, in her introduction to one of Cavendish's works, does argue that she was influenced by Stoicism, and that the blending of the three types of matter may be a Stoic influence.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Marlene, we have a couple questions in chat. We'll start with Isaiah's. Could you say more about the role of reduction in regard to Cavendish's materialism? As, for example, Metternich, Diderot, Hobbes, etc., will argue for a bottom-up position for materialism, reductionism of higher properties to mechanics, while Cavendish is an anti-reductionist materialist by attributing higher-level properties such as soul to matter itself. Mm-hmm. Maybe this is why you see Conway and Cavendish as quite similar to one another.
Yeah, that's totally right. So, in the way, thank you for your question, Isaiah. How do you pronounce your first name? Oh, Isaiah?
It's Isaiah. It's a long story.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. Awesome.
Yeah. So coincidentally, I got an email from Isaiah this morning. So nice to meet you visually. So Cavendish and Conway are very different in the way they express themselves, because Cavendish says all is matter. So she sounds like a materialist when she says that. Conway doesn't do that. She outright argues against materialism, and she has Hobbes in mind. So the polemical stances they take are different, but then when you look at what properties they actually attribute to matter, like I said at the beginning, they're very, very similar. So yeah, anti-reductionist. So Hobbes is a materialist in a mechanistic sense. His matter is mechanistic, but Cavendish thinks that mechanism is hopeless. It's not just that it can't explain everything. She thinks it can't explain anything because the metaphysics of mechanism is not viable, because she thinks the Hobbesian interaction between bodies doesn't work. So yeah, she's an anti-reductionist, And Alison Simmons and I have quarreled over whether we should call our women materialists or not. Alison has the upper hand in the sense that, because she would argue that you should call them materialists, and the reason why she has the upper hand to some extent is if you want to call someone an immaterialist or anything like that, then you would need to say that that person denies material properties of their stuff, and neither Cavendish nor Conway do that. So they accept traditional properties of matter like extension, divisibility, impenetrability, and then they add a whole bunch of stuff to that, and then they say there's no problem thinking that matter has all of these qualities, all of these features. Yeah. Yeah, good.
Great. Thanks for that. We have a question in the chat from Evan, and for everyone's that just is continuing to arrive, we're about 10 or 15 minutes behind schedule. So we're going to have the question and answer on on Marlene's Cavendish paper, and then we'll move on to the next one. So Evan asks, thanks for the very interesting talk, Marlene. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the relationship between Cavendish's metaphysical views, as discussed in the beginning of the talk, and the criticism of human exceptionalism, as discussed in the second half.
Yeah.
Is the criticism of human exceptionalism a consequence of the metaphysics, or vice versa, or perhaps they're equiprimordial?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm very glad you're asking that question, Evan. I don't see, oh yeah, there you are. Yeah. Yeah, because I myself wonder about that sometimes. So it's not just a consequence of the metaphysics. And there are a couple of reasons for saying that. So the metaphysics is really the monism, right? The non-reductive monism. But then, you know, in the philosophical letters, she does allow that human beings have immaterial supernatural souls. Now, in the ground, a later work, she denies that we have it in that interesting argument that I read out to you. So she has that metaphysics of matter all the way through, but the stuff about immaterial souls for humans changes over time. Now, there's a further reason for saying that a metaphysics isn't the only explanation, and that is because she also, as you saw, argues energetically that humans are not rational in a superior way to other creatures, right? So when you could be a materialist of the kind that she is, or a Hobbesian, and think that humans just have much more complicated brains or something like that, right? And so have a higher level of mentality, and he rejects that, which is unusual. Yeah. Yeah, so thanks for that question. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Marlene. Next is Brad Thompson.
Hey, Marlene, it's nice to see you again.
Yes, right.
I'm not sure if I understand anything that you said about Cavendish, in particular the theory of cause and effect. I've written my question down. Would the reason for the second billiard ball moving be its choice upon the occasion of the first ball choosing to hit it, to move itself as a result? And secondly, if the billiard ball is composed of parts, do all of the parts choose to cooperate as an ensemble to become collectively the one ball? And would they therefore be making a joint decision to move upon the occasion of the first ball hitting it? If that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense.
Good.
unlike Cavendish's view on your view. Yeah, so one thing that you bring in there that I cut out of the paper because I felt I wouldn't have time is the fact that she also describes freedom to all of nature. So
that was part of my question, yes.
Yeah, she does, and I didn't have time to discuss that. And I'm not sure why she does that. So one possibility could be her anti-human exceptionalism. Could be that that's the ground of it. There's no reason to think, maybe on her view, that humans are superior in having free will. That's a possibility. So that's one aspect of what you're talking about. And the other aspect is much more difficult, and that is that how should we exactly understand the reaction of a billiard ball to impact with another ball? She makes clear that when the ball that receives the blow, when it receives it, what it does is it perceives what the first ball does, and she calls that patterning. So the ball patterns out, as she puts it, what the first ball is doing. So if you go like this, like my fist hits my open hand, right? My hand perceives what my fist is doing, and in response, it initiates its own motion.
Yeah.
What you're bringing in is the element of choice. And I don't know what to do with that, because when she argues against mechanistic interaction, she's very clear that there's self-activity. So this hand initiates its own motion rather than getting it from my fist. But that doesn't yet appeal to freedom. But she does talk a lot in terms of consent. And indeed, if you think of the ball as composed of parts, which she also does, then what do the parts have to consent?
I think
Or-
so. It sounds like she would be committed to that kind of a theory.
Yes, I don't know. I haven't figured out her stuff on freedom. Some people have argued that she holds a libertarian view of freedom. I don't know whether that is true. Some texts suggest that she connects freedom with self-motion, so it's more like freedom of spontaneity, which doesn't entail, some robust ability to act otherwise. My mind's completely open about that. I haven't had a time to investigate that issue. But for me, it's clearer why she attributes sense and rationality to all of nature than why she attributes freedom to all of nature. And I don't understand how all of that's supposed to work in the case that you describe. So, yeah. I'm afraid I just agree with your puzzlement.
So, thanks. Next, we have Fabio Mafera.
Hey, Marlene. How are you? It's been a long time.
Yeah, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too. Thank you so much for your talk. It was fantastic.
Oh, great. I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah, no, it was great. And actually, my question has a lot to do with the question that Brad just asked. So, I wondered if maybe I could ask for maybe your take on Cavendish's motivation for saying that matter can sort of respond in the way that it does upon sort of impact. And the reason, and I wonder if she may run into some sort of trouble with a sort of Malebranchian knowledge argument for occasionalism, right? So Malebranche might say something like, and it's nice because he applies this to the mind, but for Cavendish, I think it applies to the matter equally. And something like, well, in order for matter to be a true causal agent in this case, Malebranche might say, well, it needs to have sort of an infinite knowledge of all of the motion that's being sort of impacted on it by the other body, and it would need to know sort of all of the particular physics and mechanics behind it. And so is it really truly possible for the sort of the body being impacted to reciprocate or sort of mirror the motion that the other body is applying to it, right? Just because, I mean, how would it go about mirroring it or sort of enacting the same sort of pattern? Do you know if Cavendish might have anything to say in response, or some sort of motivation that she has for that sort of argument?
Well, one historical question is, I have no knowledge that you read Malebranche, and I don't know when that type of argument was first launched. So I can't remember Malebranche's dates. I never can.
It would be, I guess it would be in the search, but then there's also, I mean, I'm not so sure how familiar she would have been with Gelinx, who also offers the knowledge argument for occasionalism a few years earlier. So it would definitely be mid to late 1600s, early 1700s.
Yeah, too late for her. It's a very interesting argument. The thing is, because she sees knowledge everywhere, I'm not sure she would be too startled by that idea. Yeah, it's sort of yeah. That's my initial reaction to that question. One question that it raises, which I don't know that she ever addresses, is, well, does she think in terms of unconscious mental states, like Leibniz did, right? Like oodles and oodles of perception in Leibniz, most of them are unconscious, and that really is important to Leibniz because so much of his system appeals to us having various perceptions and other things having perceptions. And I don't know, I can't remember offhand whether in the literature, the rapidly growing literature on Cavendish, that question has been addressed, the notion of the question of consciousness in Cavendish.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I think because that probably presupposes my own question, right? I suppose if matter is conscious or not really sort of will depend on her answer to my question. So yeah, no, I think that's interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question in chat from Linnell. Linnell says, perhaps she's thinking a pervasive kind of reason present in matter, such as in the Stoic theory, or perhaps in terms of Giordano Bruno's views.
Okay, so I don't know those theories. So one of my things I have to do is I'm urgently in need of studying Stoicism. It's becoming more and more important. And if the plague, as my chair calls it, would end, it would be easier because then my teaching wouldn't take so much time. But what idea do you have in mind specifically with that?
Yeah, I mean, about how Margaret Cavendish would be thinking on a principle of a matter that an active principle of matter.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
that would require.
Yes, a kind of reason, a pervasive kind of principle of motion, and which also implies certain rules of this motion. Yeah. So perhaps there's a kind of a Stoic theory here, which attributes to matter, I think, this principle. But I don't know.
Yeah,
I haven't read Margaret Cavendish.
Yes, yeah. So all of matter is rational, but maybe your question is about nature as a whole. So she often personifies nature. Well, personifies, maybe that's too strong. But anyway, she often talks about nature as a whole, as in one of the texts that I read to you, nature orders its parts. Right? So then it's as if nature as a whole is an agent, and the parts also are agents. So it's almost like it's like a model of a society with members.
Yes. Yeah.
So then you indeed it feels as if you have an overarching reason in addition to there being reason in the parts.
Yeah. That I think that would also fit with this Stoic idea that we are kind of image for the social image from the cosmos. No? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So Ben Hill says Cavendish died before the Search was published. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Search was 74, and it's unlikely. I guess she would have read Gelinx. Gelinx would have been published in Latin, but I don't remember when it was circulating. I don't know that it was published early when it was written. I just don't remember the dates of the publication.
So I just did a quick search and it was 1650s, 1660s that Goodlinks' works were circulating. So maybe not.
Yeah.
So I think if there's no further questions, it's good to have maybe a short break, have a chance to stretch your legs a bit, take a nature break, and we can reconvene at 3:15 Eastern. So it's in about 5 or 6 minutes. So please join me in thanking our speaker, both virtually and in person if you wish.